Another thing that we should talk about with developmental psychology is theories. So, a lot of people use the term theory incorrectly. You might have heard someone during an argument or something be really dismissive of a point someone's making by saying, oh, that's just a theory. So, that's not actually how scientists use the term theory. So, just to be clear, before we dive into some modern developmental theories, well, historical and modern developmental theories, let's be clear about what a theory is. So this could be really useful for any of your science classes. So rather than some general idea or some proposed explanation, a theory is actually a really broad idea or a whole bunch of sets of ideas all mixed together that can explain and predict observations. So to have a theory, first you've got a lot of data, a lot of evidence, and this is a theory is the way that you are describing and predicting, explaining all of that evidence all round up together. That's why when we say something like the theory of gravity, it's not that we think that gravity might suddenly not exist. It's the way that we describe all of our explanations from all of the different areas that study this, that all of that together is the theory of gravity. An example in psychology, especially developmental psychology, is the theory of attachment. How do attachments work, like secure attachments or insecure attachments? How are those relevant? How can we take the observations we have around attachment styles and explain and then predict people's behaviors with those attachment styles? So that is how we use theory. Another important key piece of a theory is that we try to make it falsifiable. And so falsifiable basically means we have to state it or describe the theory, describe this evidence in a way that we could potentially prove the theory false, so that it can be testable to be able to prove it false. So let's give some examples of this, of falsification, to make this a little more clear. Let's use a older theory from back many generations ago. So this is the theory of spontaneous generation. So Aristotle and many people in the day believed that matter simply became other matter, that it generated other matter. And that was based on their observations. Remember, a theory is this broad idea or set of ideas. Spontaneous generation was the way that they explained their observations. And so they saw things like dead wood becoming mushrooms. So it looked like the dead wood spawned the mushrooms. The matter of the dead wood became mushrooms instead. They saw grain on ships disappearing, and suddenly mice appeared. So the grain maybe became mice. So it was spontaneous generation was their explanation for the data and the observations that they had. Obviously, we can look at that now with further science and observation and say, well, that doesn't really make sense with how these things work. But they didn't have all those tools at the time. So let's talk about how this theory was falsified. So that spontaneous generation was the broad idea or set of ideas together that explained these observations. It explained what they could observe with their eyes. So the falsification for this theory took quite a long time. So it was first falsified or proved false by Francisco Redi in 1668. Essentially, he found that maggots did not spontaneously generate from all rotting meat. And what he did was that my face might be covering up some of these images here, but there's a glass jar that's open to the air with some meat in it, and a glass jar that's closed to the air with meat in it. He put both of those out in the same environment, and lo and behold, we found that the glass jar that was open to the air developed maggots. The one that was closed to the air did not. And so, poof, everybody abandoned spontaneous generation. It was never a thing again. People didn't ever think of it. No, that's not the case. It took quite a while because, as well as showing that that one theory, spontaneous generation, didn't explain everything it should, you have to have a new theory to explain all of the new observations that you're making. So it actually took quite a while. One of the problems here was that when another researcher might try this study, maybe they don't have as good of control over the variables, control over the environment. Maybe the jar is not sealed well enough. So it actually took until 1859 and Louis Pasteur, Pasteur, so he was the same person with that, it took a very similar experiment. Rather than chunks of meat to be a little more controlled, he boiled some meat broth and put it in a sealed flask or a swan-necked flask. So, and was able to see that, hey, in these flasks, that weird film, they didn't know what it was called yet, that weird film didn't generate. So, but again, other people had to replicate this, and the problem is with what we know as bacteria now, it can survive, well, some kinds can survive being boiled. That's why Yellowstone has so many amazing colors, is because there are bacteria living in the different heat levels within geysers. So in some cases, people didn't have all the control over their variables. They didn't have as good of methods yet. And so when they tried to falsify, they tried to do another experiment to show that spontaneous generation didn't explain it. It didn't work out the way that they were thinking. So it took those 200 years about to come up with a new theory of what was happening here. It takes a while to throw away that new theory completely. Maybe there's some other thing happening that's outside of spontaneous generation. Maybe there's a second theory to explain, or there's some adjustments we can make to it. But we did eventually falsify or prove spontaneous generation to be false because it was described or discussed in a way that we could test it to make sure it was false. An example of that with something like the theory of gravity, our current understanding is at a specific point. But if we discover maybe other particles or waves or other aspects that are affecting gravity, maybe we can then alter our theory of gravity, include those into it. Or it might require us to completely rethink how we describe the theory of how gravity is working. So that is what scientists do. So that's how we actually use theories. It's really broad overall explanations of things rather than just one little prediction. So a good video to watch on this is here. We're not going to watch this whole thing to 15 minutes, but we'll watch a little bit of it, and hopefully I can capture the audio well enough as we do this.
To do if I tried. Flat Earth and other debates about otherwise accepted scientific fact bring out a much larger problem. Our understanding of science is terrible. And I'm not complaining that people don't remember the laws of thermodynamics or that I still don't understand how magnets work. Water, fire, air, and dirt. And magnets, how do they work? I'm talking about the philosophy of science. So, what is the philosophy of science? It's philosophy, obviously, that asks questions like, how do we distinguish science from non-science? And with that, how should we weigh evidence when testing a hypothesis? What kind of evidence is acceptable? Basically, how do we know if we know shit? You might remember learning the scientific method, and that's part of it, but it barely scratches the surface. There are a lot of philosophies of science, and I'm not here to tell you what the right model is. It's important to understand that all of these frameworks have strengths and weaknesses. And to us, it's our general ignorance of how science works that allows for the abuse of scientific language we see in things like flat Earth. So to get a better understanding of how flat earthers can use the language of science and evidence to persuade people, let's go back in time. In the early 1900s, there was a scientific doctrine posed by a group known as logical positivists called verificationism. This model essentially posits that science is something that can be verified. If it can't be verified, it ain't science. So philosophical statements like the meaning of life is be excellent to each other, not science because, how would you verify that? Let's start with a very simple example. If I were to say this swan is white, you could say, hey, it looks white to me. I could pass it around and you could also verify it is white. So awesome. We're using our senses in a way that can be replicated by others. So it's been verified. And as such, this swan is white could be considered a meaningful scientific statement. In this model, if you want to verify that the Earth is round or flat, one way would be to go up in space and look at it.
How do you know it's a globe? Well, it's because you saw this. It's not like you've been up there in your Jetsons car. Nobody's got a spaceship.
And in this way, flat earthers seem to at least allude to this basic idea of verification. But how do you verify a statement like all swans are white, which Europeans considered to be the case before the 1600s? Let's say you and others have encountered thousands of swans and every single one was white. Is this evidence enough? Well, not quite for the verificationist, and this was a huge problem for them. When it came to universal statements like all swans are white, all hipsters drink PBR, all mass exerts gravitational pull, you can never truly verify that. What if there's a theoretical hipster out there who shuns PBR in favor of Heineken? Heineken, yes, blue ribbon! Or a black swan, which, by the way, was discovered by Europeans in Australia in the 1690s. Now, flat earthers may latch on.
All right, so before we get some more of this example, let's go back to what we were just talking about on those slides. So with this, we were talking about falsifying things. So this video is talking about verification, right? So that is what we had before we got to falsification. So it's going to move forward. So hopefully you can see how that verifying is still something that we do use in science. We do both verify and falsify still. The kind of gold standard is to do falsification to make sure we are trying to prove our theories wrong, that we're trying to poke holes in it kind of thing. So it'll give a couple more examples of how we transition from verifying to falsification. But still, even now in all sciences, verification, you might have heard of things like replication. Oftentimes, replication is another example of verifying. It's verifying a previous finding, maybe a previous finding looks like it falsified a theory, so we verify, we try it again. And that's what we see here from this going from Francisco already all the way to Pasteur of both falsifying and verifying throughout in this process of science.
Does logic and say, well, we haven't verified the Earth is round with our eyes. But if we try to apply this as a doctrine for science that all individuals have to see things with our eyes, it'd be pretty limiting.
If there's an event like I'll just use Boston bombing again, I'm not going to believe any of those events are real unless myself I get my leg blown off.
But as far as our all swans are white problem, this was a pretty big crisis for verificationism, until a philosopher named Karl Popper proposed a now famous solution. Rather than focusing on verification, scientists should rather focus on falsification. For Popper, good science is coming up with a hypothesis and then trying really hard to prove it wrong. If you can't, you can be confident in your hypothesis, say that all swans are white, but that doesn't mean it won't get proven wrong when, say, we discover a black swan or two in ensuing decades.
So this is what we do in science. We've moved from that verification to focusing on falsification, and you see that happening in this specific example of falsifying spontaneous generation. So again, this goes back to a theory is that big, broad explanation of things. So in this, they're giving smaller examples like all swans are white. But again, we're talking overall about theories, the big, broad explanations of how things work. And still, for those theories, we're trying to falsify. We're trying to do studies that show that it doesn't work in the scenario that it's supposed to work in, that in this way or in this group, it's not exactly the same. And so that's the idea. If we're trying to poke holes in it and we have a good explanation, then even when we try, it'll still hold up. And so that's how we know we have a good, strong theory, like the theory of gravity. In, say, middle or high school, you may have heard that above theory is law. Scientists don't actually use that term because we know that when we have more data, when we have better measures, we might have a better way to explain how gravity works than we currently do. So we don't call it a law. That's why we still do call it a theory, because we still are open to it changing and modifying as we learn more and can make that theory stronger. So just a couple more minutes of this video.
If a statement could not theoretically be falsified, it ain't science. So the meaning of life is to be excellent to each other is still not science. So if I thought the Earth was flat, I might design several experiments which could prove it wasn't flat. And if my hypothesis that the Earth isn't flat is correct, then it's probably time to abandon flat Earth. Importantly, proving that the Earth is not flat does not prove that it is round, nor does proving that the Earth is not round prove that it is flat. What if it's, say, a donut balanced on a giant turtle? Now, we're going to talk a lot about Popper here, but
So that is another key thing here. Just because you falsify one aspect of a theory doesn't mean that the theory cannot possibly be altered to better explain. So like this example, it's kind of silly, but I think of the turtle from Avatar: The Last Airbender when he talks about the donut on the back of a turtle. But essentially, it could be explained another way. Maybe there's a better way to explain this theory. Maybe we can adjust. So the key of science is How much should we adjust it versus when do we abandon a current theory in favor of a new, better explanation? And that's kind of a hard part with theory that we actually deal with in science. So going back to this, the theory is that broad idea or set of ideas. It combines all the observations about something. We have a lot of data already. So this is actually a modern developmental theory. This is called this is the zone of proximal development. It's a sociocultural learning theory. So Vygotsky's sociocultural learning theory. And the whole theory as a whole combines ideas about learning through observation, through practice, through mentoring, and emphasizes the culture a person is in. But one key piece is this zone of proximal development. So from that overarching theory, that big broad explanation, we can build hypotheses. So hypotheses are a specific testable idea that comes from that theory. And as we try to test those and falsify this theory more and more ways, the theory can either be stronger or we can see that it doesn't actually quite explain things super well. So with this theory of the zone of proximal development, Vygotsky's sociocultural learning theory, I might make a specific hypothesis. If the overall theory says that people can learn from other people, from being mentored, then I might hypothesize that a 3-year-old can learn basic math with help. And that is one prediction that you'd make based off of Vygotsky's theory. So I could test that, right? I could go and do an experiment where I take a room of 3-year-olds. Half of them, I just give them math problems and let them try to do it on their own. Then the other half, I give them tutors. I have the tutors try and teach them to see if they can learn that basic math with help. And that would suggest that maybe in this case, if it comes out that they are learning math, then that might suggest that the theory is a little stronger. It is making good predictions and explanations. But if it turns out that I can't teach those young people, that is kind of a falsification against that theory and suggests, well, maybe it's not the best explanation. So that's how we actually use theories and pull hypotheses from them. So let's get that out of the way. Now we have a lot better understanding of theory, and we can talk about some of the older theories in developmental psychology. So Freud was a father of psychoanalytic theory. There are others who came after as well. The main idea behind this theory is that we have a bunch of unconscious drives and motives that drive us to do things. So for Freud, a lot of these were sexual impulses that were completely unconscious, like we had no awareness of them and led us to do different behaviors or make different choices. So other psychoanalytic theorists that we'll even talk about throughout this course are Erikson. Erikson talked about them not as psychosexual stages, but talked about life developing through psychosocial stages, that our interactions with other people gave us unconscious drives that led us to try and get through different crises through life. So things like trust versus mistrust earlier on in life, in adolescence, identity versus being confused about your roles in the world, to in later adulthood, have you lived a life of integrity or are you despairing because you did not? So these are looking at social, unconscious social motivations for behaviors. So here's another diagram of that, of the different age ranges of these different crises for Erikson. So again, these psychosocial theories are trying to take observations that the researchers made and make predictions, make explanations under a big name of this psychosocial theory. Another form of theory are cognitive theories. These often focus on conscious thoughts, the thought processes, how memory works. So some that you'll see throughout the book are Piaget's cognitive developmental theory, so Vygotsky's sociocultural theory we just mentioned a few minutes ago, and emotion or information processing theory. These are examples of some types of cognitive theories that are about what is going on within your brain. How is it processing information? So here's some of Piaget's stages. So we've got sensory motor early on in life, pre-operational in still early childhood. Then as we get towards adolescence, concrete operational. And then for Piaget specifically, after you get to be about 12 years old, your brain has kind of figured out how to do its processing and you don't have any more change after that. Not actually the case. We'll talk a lot about that in this lifespan development class, but that is not actually the case. We do have a lot of change in our cognition throughout the lifespan. Additionally, with these observations, they were a good place to start, but we see a lot of these happen earlier than Piaget thought. Better methods and better ways to test have let us see a lot of these happen earlier on. So Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, the broad thing is that people construct their knowledge and understanding. So again, this is a cognitive theory. What is going on within your brain? How are you putting things together? Vygotsky's described this as a sociocultural theory, basically the idea that any person is influenced by the cultures around them, and that culture gives them or mentors them in the tools of the culture. So a good example of a tool is language. So whatever culture you're in, you will learn the language or languages that are relevant to that culture. You might learn math if that's relevant. You might learn how to hunt. You might learn how to use a bus system, right? Whatever is important to the culture and community around you is going to be delivered to you. And you'll be able to start from what you can do without any help. And this zone of proximal development are those stretch things. So when you have a mentor, when you have someone giving you direct instruction, you're stretching, you're making advancements, but there's still things that you can't do. If you think of this in the sense of learning a new skill, let's say skateboarding, you might be able to balance on a skateboard, but you might not be able to do any tricks. You might not be able to do a kickflip, for example. But with help, maybe you can. Maybe you can learn that within a day, right? But you're still not going to be going to the X Games and or the Olympics and trying to skate in that kind of setting. So, but with this, you could get to that point, right? If you kept getting training, you kept getting mentorship, you kept working on it or being an apprentice for something, that circle of what you can do expands and expands and expands. So. It's a good positive way to think about learning and developing skills. A lot of education research still uses this sociocultural theory. Other cognitive theories, like the information processing theory, kind of look at humans as computers and try to understand how are we using different components of our brain specifically to do different processes. Another area of psychological theories are behavioral theories. So behaviorism really looks at behaviors. So things like raising your hand, things like are you actually did you sneeze? Did you share with someone? So actual behaviors that you can observe. And so some big pieces of this are reinforcement or punishment. So reinforcement is anything that increases a behavior over time. Punishment is anything that decreases a behavior over time. So it's not necessarily a rewarding thing for everybody, right? So a spicy food might be very reinforcing for a lot of people. For some people, it might have a punishing effect, right? And it might make you less likely to do that thing. So let's say in your fourth grade class, your teacher gives you a candy every time that you get 90% on a test. The thing is, this teacher has really spicy candies. So that's the type of candy they like. So that's what they give out. So as you might have one person who they get that 90%, they get that spicy candy and they're like, this is great. I really want more of this spicy candy. I'm going to do really well on the next test. Then you have another student who does really well on the test. They get that spicy candy and they say, oh, I really don't like this. I am maybe not going to try as hard on the test next time. It's now had a punishing effect for one student and a reinforcing effect for another. So that's what reinforcements and punishments actually are. And we look at the behaviors. Did they actually do well the next time? So this is a good video. If you want to go to the slides, you can watch it. It's a rat that was trained. I don't remember offhand if this one was the rat I trained or the rat my wife trained. If I click on it, I'll be able to tell. That's the rat I trained. So this was Crystal the rat, and it is a rat that I trained to do some parkour type of tricks through behavioral learning. So behaviorists also started to put into their theories social and cognitive pieces. So the idea here is that, yep, there's behaviors, but your behaviors can affect your cognition, and environmental factors can affect them as well. So this is a loop. The environment can affect behavior, which can then affect your cognitive factors, or this can affect this. All of them can affect one another. So a good example of this and social cognitive theory is the Bobo doll experiment. So you take a bunch of kids, you put them in a room with this Bobo doll, they can play with it. If you give half of them an example of an adult punching it, kicking it, then you'll see more kids are going to punch and kick that Bobo doll. They have learned from this social cognitive process and observational learning. So more recently, the main theories in developmental psychology are these ethological and ecological systems theories. So I usually just refer to them as systems theories. So ethological is that behavior is influenced by biology, evolution, and sensitive periods in life. So one example of that is that we have evolved, it seems, the capacity to learn language really easily when we're fairly young. So if you learn more than one language when you're very young, it makes it easier later on, but that's a sensitive period for learning language. It's a lot harder for an adult than, say, a 5-year-old to learn a new language. So if you're immigrating to a new country when you are an adult and you have a child with you, that child's probably going to learn the new language a lot quicker than you as the adult will. So again, unless you already have a couple languages under your belt, then it'll be a lot easier for you. So ecological focuses on studying the change and specifically around with the environment. So this is looking at systems around people, how they influence a person, how the person influences them. So one of the theories that we've shown already is Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems model. So here we have the systems directly around us, the people and the things we're interacting with on a daily, weekly basis. So the microsystem, we've got your family, if you have a church, the health services that you're using irregularly, your peers, maybe roommates, the school, and these are all having a very direct, immediate impact on you, and you can usually have a pretty immediate impact on them. Outside of that microsystem, we have the exosystem, which is like the people that you interact with every once in a while. Maybe the mass media has some impact on you. Maybe the local politics are relevant. Here under my face, it says social services. So depending on what social services are available, it might impact your peers and your school and your family. Do you have access to healthy foods, for example? That will impact your microsystem. And so those connections between exosystem and microsystem are described as the mesosystem, just a fancy name for that. And then the macro system is the biggest one. It's the broader economic, social, and political climate. So the ideologies or the culture that you're embedded in. And so you can have an effect on these ideologies and attitudes of the culture, but it's usually indirectly through these other systems, right? And in this diagram here, it's just got another couple examples to make it clear what these different systems are. So that is a systems theory. As we change over time, these aspects influence us, we influence them at the same time. Another way to look at this is learners' developmental systems theory. And I really like this one a little bit more, even though the basic idea behind them is very similar. I like this one a lot because it emphasizes this bidirectional interaction. It really has a focus on you influencing others, others influencing you back, and that system. You can have a positive impact on them, they might have a positive impact back on you, or alternatively, a negative impact. Maybe you can have a positive upward spiral or a negative downward spiral. So a big key with these systems theories is realizing that development is relatively plastic. A lot of things can change to some degree. It also means there's a lot to look at, right? You could look at how a culture is impacting a school network and impacting a child's grades. That's one study you could do. And so if you've got to have a lot of researchers doing this, you've got to have maybe an education researcher working with you. You might want to look at the biology of an individual, the biology of their parents. Maybe you want a biologist to do that, right? So we can work with other people. And it does emphasize that these contexts, that these different settings are really very important for our human development. So we have moved from, I'll just scroll back really quickly, from things like this original psychoanalytic theory at the origins, and psychoanalytic theory isn't completely gone. There's still aspects of it that are still used, even though it's not in the same form that Freud used. like we mentioned, Erickson will talk about in the future, cognitive, sociocultural, behavioral, all of this is really wrapped up into current developmental theories like the bioecological systems model or the other systems theory of learners' developmental systems theory. So with this, it is showing both the big picture and trying to focus in with the systems theory. That being said, as we're going through the book, it does take different approaches. Like it might talk about one study specifically from a behaviorist standpoint. It might talk about another specifically from a psychoanalytic standpoint. So relying on just one theory is not necessarily the best. Seeing a lot of them and how they've been used throughout the history of psychology is one thing that we'll get in this class as well. And the book demonstrates the research that happens from a lot of researchers. They have different assumptions, they come from different backgrounds. So most current research in development does use this bioecological systems theories and these developmental systems theories.